Hi, everyone. Welcome to, I think this is the first working group of our conference, and we'll have one tomorrow again. And this is on research design and methodological challenges. My name is Beatrice, and I'll be helping us stay organized throughout this working group session. So just in a minute, I'm a second-year PhD student in the political science department at Columbia. And I personally work on field experiments, and I try to work on understanding how social norms and identities form across different contexts, including the idea of being a refugee and that identity, how that is shaped by the experience of living in a refugee camp. So today we have two amazing panelists that are going to get us started. So we have here Dr. Rebecca Littman, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Dr. Rebecca Wolfe, who's an assistant instructional professor at the Harris School for Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And thank you both for being here and introducing us to this topic. If I understand correctly, you're going to give some joint remarks, so to get us started. So floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Rebecca, I'll get the presentation up for us.
Thank you.
So you're getting double Rebecca's today, talking about research design and methodological challenges. And we often collaborate together, so we refer to each other by our initials to make it easier when we do that. So Rebecca, do you want to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. And first of all, thank you to Biz, Justine, Celia for organizing this great event. I'm so happy to be here and was able to make time to do it. It's a topic that really needs more conversation. So I am, as Beatrice said, at the University of Chicago at the Harris School. I joined about a year and a half ago, right before the pandemic. And before that, many of you may know I was at Mercy Corps, a humanitarian and development organization working on a combination of both program development, designing peace building programs and humanitarian interventions, as well as doing research and field experiments to evaluate them. And so I bring a kind of a combination of both practitioner and not just researching in those areas, but actually designing the programs using the theories we actually study and use as academics, which was always quite exciting. Rebecca?
All right. So I'm Rebecca Littman. I'm an assistant professor in the psychology department at University of Illinois, Chicago. And I'm a social psychologist. So, my expertise is not in clinical psychology. So anything I say on that topic, really take with a grain of salt. I have a lot to learn from many of you who are here today. A lot of my research is on reconciliation and reintegration in conflict and post-conflict settings. And most recently, pretty much all of my work is in Nigeria. And I want to thank Rana for bringing up the idea of positionality in the last session. So, let's be open about this. Of course, I am a white American young woman from an upper middle class background doing a lot of research in Nigeria, and I'm going to be talking about my experiences doing research there. So of course, that's something that's important to acknowledge. All right. So Rebecca and I collaborate a lot, and so we thought we would give a joint presentation. So you'll be hearing from both of us throughout this presentation. So as we started to chat with each other about what are some of the methodological and design issues that we often come across and think about and talk to each other about when it comes to working in environments with a lot of violence and trauma, there were two big questions that stood out for us that we want to focus on now, and just to get everyone thinking about for when you go into your breakout rooms and chat together. So the first is, what is the effect of us going into communities and in surveys asking people about the violence that they've experienced and the trauma that they've experienced, both for our research participants as well as for our interviewers in settings who are going out and asking these questions many times a day, day after day. And of course, an extrapolation of this is, what are the effects for the members of the research teams and any RAs we have outside of a country where we might be doing research. We won't touch on that now. So we're really focusing on research participants and interviewers who are asking participants these questions. And the other big question is, what are the design challenges as scientists who are going in and trying to do a rigorous study? What are the challenges we face when we work in violent contexts? So I'm going to touch on this first question, and then Rebecca's other Rebecca will come in on the second question. So as we thought about this broad question, what are the effects? I think oftentimes we start with, we might be doing harm, how do we mitigate this? But we want to take a step back and actually say, are we causing distress when we do this? And does this vary by context? If we're in a conflict or post-conflict environment, if we're in a really religious versus non-religious context, if we're in a refugee context. So I think, there are lots of questions around this, but the first place to start is, are we causing distress? If we are, when do the benefits of what we're doing, either research-wise or programming, maybe outweigh any potential distress we're causing, depending on how much distress? And then, of course, if we are causing distress, what are ways that we can try and mitigate it? So we have a couple of thoughts on these things just to get everyone, again, thinking about this topic. So we're going to start with this question, are we actually causing distress? So in 2016, a paper came out that was evaluating the Fumble Talk program in Sierra Leone that Melanie talked about in the last session. And this evaluation showed that while this program that has people air what happened to them during the conflict in these traditional reconciliation ceremonies, while it increased social capitals in communities, it also decreased individual well-being and had negative psychological costs for individuals. And Rebecca and I saw this, and we were about to go in and start a study in northeastern Nigeria on Boko Haram reintegration. And so we had this in mind, and we thought we need to take this really seriously. I mean, obviously, this is the effect of a whole program, not just a survey. But if a program can have this effect, what effect might we be having when we go into Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria and start asking people about their experiences with conflict and trauma they experienced because of Boko Haram? So we had this in mind, and we started to do some focus groups. And what we started to see kind of surprised us. So we came in maybe assuming like the questions we ask are going to cause distress. But we actually, in a lot of our focus groups, were seeing more of a cathartic response. So there was one focus group that's really stuck out in my mind always, where afterwards, there was this emotional conversation where we were with a group of women who were telling their stories. And then at the end, a number of them said things like, wow, I'm going to sleep well tonight for the first time in a long time because I actually had the chance to tell my story. Someone asked, someone cared, someone listened. So that got us thinking, maybe in a conflict environment where conflict is still going on, it's salient in people's lives all day, every day, asking about what's happened to them. It's not bringing something up that they aren't already thinking about. And in a context like that, maybe we aren't doing harm. And who knows, maybe for some people it could be cathartic. So we were just about to launch a study. So we were going to ask about violence, and we were going to ask about mental health anyways. So we thought, why don't we randomize the order and just see what happens? So we randomized whether we asked people about mental health before or after we asked about their experiences with violence. And here, mental health was a number of questions about PTSD that asked people, in your life now, do you ever experience this symptom? And then in a second sample that I'll tell you about in a second, we also added a question at the beginning, just how anxious do you feel right now? And we did this in Maiduguri with about 4,000 people who had experienced Boko Haram violence, and then also with a sample of around 3,000 people in Kaduna in northern Nigeria in a context of communal interreligious violence. And essentially, we find in these particular contexts, we find no evidence, of course, survey experiment, lots of caveats, but here we find no evidence that people report increased PTSD symptoms, in your life right now, or anxiety when asked about experiences with violence, and a pretty detailed long battery of experiences with violence before we ask about mental health compared to when we ask about it after. And if anything, we actually find that people are reporting less anxiety and fewer symptoms. So there's a little bit of evidence here for maybe a bit of a cathartic effect. Now, of course, take this with a grain of salt. It's a survey experiment, but we were at least happy to see that we didn't see people reporting much higher levels of distress when we asked about it right after violence than when we asked about it before talking to people about violence. But now, if we are causing distress, when do benefits outweigh the potential costs? I think particularly for social scientists, we don't want to do any harm. And so if we feel like we might be causing some distress, it's easy for us to say, stop immediately. And I think we need to question this. We need to get advice from experts in clinical psychology to say, when do benefits outweigh the potential costs? If we're causing a little bit of distress, but it's gone the next day, is some research or programming efforts, are they worth causing that little bit of distress? I don't know the answer to that. It's something that I'm raising for everyone to think about. But I think it is something that we need to think about rather than just saying, oh, there's a little bit of distress, done. We can't ask these questions. And then, of course, there's this big question: if we are causing distress, what can we do as researchers when we're conducting studies to try and mitigate any potential distress? I want to highlight one thing that often happens. I think I've been asked to do this by an IRB for every study I've ever done in a conflict setting, and this is come up with some kind of psychosocial referral system. So this is an example of the referral card that Rebecca and I used for our study in Nigeria. And I'll say this was really difficult to come up with because there are a lot of organizations in Northeast Nigeria doing psychosocial work, but there isn't a clear referral pathway. There ended up being a lot of specific people's phone numbers and names. I can tell you, I went to use this for something else about 1.5 years later, and basically none of these numbers worked anymore, and we had to completely redo this. And then there are broader questions of, is this always actually the thing that's going to make sense? Is this actually doing any good? Is this helping anyone who's distressed? In places where psychosocial care is really stigmatized, is anyone going to use these services? So again, I don't know the answers to this. This may be a really good thing that we're doing. This may not be. It might depend on the context, but just another thing I wanted to raise. I think this is often the go-to, and I don't know if it should be, and I don't know what else we should be thinking about, but I think we should take a step back and think about this more broadly. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca Wolfe to talk about the second big question.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I realize we're already almost out of time. And so what I'm going to do is I'll try to go through this relatively quickly. And we can also talk more about this in the breakout groups. So I think, one of the other areas that comes up, particularly, in what Rebecca was just saying, was a lot of the ethical issues around asking questions about violence and what it could do to individuals. But I think we also, doing research in these environments, there's a lot of other ethical questions around methodology that we need to think through. So if we go to the next slide. And so there's kind of 3 categories I'll hit on briefly that of the research design challenges we have. One is around the ethics of randomization, particularly in a humanitarian crisis. And again, in my work with Rebecca in Northeast Nigeria and designing some other potential research in that area, it really hit me what the dilemma was, because often we're not just working with ourselves, but we're working with people on the ground trying to alleviate the crisis. And how do we balance those 2 needs and most importantly, the needs of the populations we're trying to reach and trying to help? These are often very insecure places that we're working, and how do we keep the research participants and the interviewers safe. And then because of the challenges of security, there's often significant attrition, whether it's due to displacement and access. Sorry for that typo there. And so, but I think those are very important things to consider in your research design. So I actually, Rebecca has it, put it at the end, a list of resources, and I think it's also in the Google Sheet. I have a chapter in a book that came out about a year ago that goes into this in more detail, which we'll find a way to share. But these are kind of in working with implementers, and when I was an implementer, a lot of questions come up about the ethics of randomization. I actually was just working with the German government on a potential study, again, in Nigeria, to do some a randomized evaluation. And I think these are kind of the 4 big categories of questions that come up. One is the withholding of treatment. And I'll say that is actually, I find that's rarely the case. It's often, they're often either not enough funds to treat everyone, or there's not enough human resources to treat everyone at the same time. It's very rare that I've seen a study come about where it's actually withholding when it could be done. And so I think that resolves a lot of the concerns. Where it becomes, I've seen a harder conversation more recently, and it finally hit me why it's such a hard conversation, is, there are 4 main humanitarian principles. One being humanity and and reaching the most vulnerable. With that, I think it's very hard to get over the psychological hurdle of randomization when your goal is to be able to know that you're treating the most vulnerable people in those communities. I imagine Rana had to go, given how late it is in Jordan. But I actually worked with Rana on a study working on PTSD issues or trauma issues in Jordan with refugee populations. And one of the big discussions we had was, who has been most exposed to violence versus maybe who's less exposed. And so everyone who was most exposed to violence did get the treatment, the psychosocial intervention. And it was those in the next category where we did randomize to see the benefits. The downside of that, of course, is that we don't know how effective it was for those that probably were most affected by violence, but it was a way to at least test part of the intervention on a population. I'll just talk briefly about use of funds. Is the challenge there is, again, if I just said you don't have enough money to reach everyone, and now you're going to lop off a bunch of money to test the intervention. And I do understand why that is so hard for people when they're seeing crisis every day. I mean, that was really in Northeast Nigeria where I said, I really can't push a lot of this on our team when they're the ones having to interface with people every day who are really trying to survive. And so it's hard to tell your team, well, we're going to put a couple $100,000, if not more, into the evaluation or research. With that, we also need to better know how we're efficiently using funds. And so that is a trade-off that is hard to make, but I think is important. Let's go to the next slide. Keeping research participants and interviewers safe. Particularly in conflict zones, this is becoming more and more critical as governments become more authoritarian and would want access to this information we're gathering. It's more and more important to make sure that your data is anonymized, that there are firewalls and so forth. I've worked in a number of countries where, and working particularly on violence prevention programs with, quote, at-risk youth. If governments find out who we deem as at risk, that would be a huge problem for those research participants. And so I think that is a greater issue as we are working in contexts where governments are backsliding. I would say, there's the ongoing with security monitoring. These are very volatile situations, and I'll mention this more on the next slide. That's going to affect our access and when it is safe to go collect data. And so we need to be much more conscious of that. And then one of the challenges we've also had is both in Northeast Nigeria and elsewhere, the ethics of following up. So we would, and this, as a result, we adjust our research protocols for this. Our work in Northeast Nigeria, where we're looking at reintegration, it would have been wonderful to have a longer term follow-up to see how effective, was it just a short-term effect of our treatment or a long-term effect of these messages we used. However, by repeating our survey would both put our enumerators as well as our participants at risk, because security forces or insurgents would get a better idea of where we were sampling and more of a chance to find out what we were asking about. Lastly, adjusting research protocols. I'll just quickly say, one of the things that are good about some of the randomization or the indirect survey techniques is that it does help both keep research participants safe because and interviewers safe, because outsiders won't really understand what's being asked, and also keeps the data safer. Lastly, as I said, security environments make it such that we get higher attrition in these environments. So we need to think about our methodology. People get displaced, so we can't find them again, or it becomes more insecure and we can't access again. So one of the things we did actually in my research in Afghanistan is with a high percentage of internally displaced people is that we oversampled, knowing we would have that. I think we're seeing a lot more on mobile technologies. A lot of us, probably even in this workshop, probably had to switch to mobile technologies with the pandemic. And so we're starting to have other ways of dealing with these access issues. And with that, I'll close.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, please go ahead.
So we just, we have some resources we suggest, and I want to shout out Lauren Young, who's here, who has a fantastic paper that you can find on her website that deals with a lot of these issues. So we just have some suggestions here if you're interested in the topics we covered.
So I've pasted the suggestions that you provided in the Google document that participants will use. So thank you, first of all, both of you for your thoughts, and you gave us a lot to think about. So this is great. Thanks. Let's get to the heart of these working groups. So I'll just give you a couple of logistical points. So you will all be randomized into breakout rooms where you'll discuss for about 15 minutes on the suggested guided questions that I'm going to read and share in a Google document in the chat now. We do ask two things of you, please, for each group. If you could have a note taker to write down the main thoughts or the main ideas that came out of your group in the Google document that we provided. And we do ask that you maybe come back prepared to give us like a 1-minute key insight of what your group shared. So if we want to break off, the link to the Google document is in the chat. Right, everyone have a great conversation.
I might the type of interaction that results. The second point is that it's important to create instruments that ask people about their opinions, experience, not just be focused on checklist trauma. So making sure people have the room to express themselves and their sense. At the same time, for those who are in the discussion that I had experience, and I think it matched what was said before, is that it is overwhelmingly a positive experience for both interviewers and respondents, but that there is a need for specific trainings of interviewers on how to handle those potentially traumatic encounters when people are breaking down. What do you do concretely? And the reality is, while there are resources out there, it's probably insufficient and certainly not widely used as it could be. But again, the main part, I think, was to emphasize this ability to share experience and talk openly. And finally, noting for those of us who have worked in seriously constrained environment, there are clear risk and real risk beyond the traumatic experience associated with the interviewing itself, but there can be consequences. There can be ostracizing, there can be further questioning by armed groups or things like that. So we really have to take that into consideration, and we have to trust interviewers in deciding what is safe, when is it safe, and what to do. Now, interviewers have to trust us, and here I take a little bit from outside. We have experience and we know things that work that may at first seem, well, that may not work, but at the same time, we have to truly treat them as equal and value their perspective when they say, we can't do this, or that's not something that should be done. Interviewers are not about saving lives, and so there's no need. It's that kind of balance between risk and benefits that was outlined before. Sorry, I probably made it long, but that was 15 minutes of discussion summarized in 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. I think some of what you're saying really echoes a conversation I heard in group 7 about doing quantitative versus qualitative. And part of the idea was that in qualitative, we give people more chance to discuss. And I think, you're bringing up this great point that even in quantitative work, we can give people a chance to talk about their experiences, and that might be really important. And this is, I think, such a crucial point that in a lot of settings where we might work, word gets around fast and people might learn what you're doing. This is part when Rebecca mentioned that in our study in Northeast Nigeria, we ended up deciding we shouldn't do a follow-up, and we ended up deciding we'd go into each community for one day, and that was that. In part because even during our pilot testing, some of our interviewers were having people knock on their parents' door saying, oh, I hear that your kid is asking about Boko Haram. So, word can spread really fast, even in a large city. We were like, oh my gosh, we really, yeah. So yeah, Patrick, I agree. Really should be mixed methods. Approaches are really important, and just having a rule, which sounds so obvious, but this rule of research is never worth putting someone in harm's way, and we really have to trust our teams to tell us when they don't feel safe. All right, let's go with room 6 now, Trisha.
I'll try to summarize some of the things we said. I think similar to others, we were talking about some of the challenges being that many measures lack cultural detail and nuances, and that it's hard to communicate in a research outlet the amount of contextual details that you actually get during these interviews. So I think that's related to the combination of qualitative and quantitative work. I'd say some of the techniques to overcome, there were some great suggestions about a member of our group talked about how, like, when the IRB requires you to create these like referral networks, it's kind of a checkbox, whereas actually building relationships with members of the community, it really makes those resources real. And I thought that was a great suggestion. And also just providing weekly check-ins, providing wellness training and support groups to the people who are doing the interviewing. And then some of the logistical things of like interviewing and using images to prevent scales, and how scales and surveys are very weird things sometimes. And so trying to translate in a way that feels more natural. And I'd say lastly, for future pathways, we talked about, if you're an outsider, recognize that you don't really know the right way to do this, and it's important to bring someone on from the local context as a trainer, reviewer, contributor, to the work and be aware of positions of power. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And again, with what you just said there, the amount of time we spend on translating, for example, and in some languages, like one of the things we really struggled with is the Likert type scale didn't work. And we've really had to think about like we had to make things dichotomous, but how does that also shift some of our results and our interpretation of things? And without our local team, we would never have been able to pick that up. So I think we're on number 4, or I don't think there was a group 4 in the end. So Nareen.
Hi. A lot of the things that we talked about kind of had to do with the grappling between like, how do you have the most like scientific scrutiny and like be rigorous and like publishable, and then also like grapple with like wanting to be the most like humane and empathic in your work, especially like on the ground settings with vulnerable people. And then how do you do that while navigating bureaucratic and administrative barriers and IRBs? And then as your own self, like if you're doing things like conducting interviews, how do you deal with your insider outsider status and reflexivity and work on building trust? But then also like how much intimacy is necessary for that relationship, but then also like what is overstepping that, and then what is your obligation to the people that you are studying, and then these like how do you go about your methodological choices and grappling with these things. One idea that was posed that was actually really interesting was we can ask questions during interviews that are not directly in relation to the purpose of the research, but that can be helpful to the community overall. Beyond that, a lot of the ways that we said would be necessary to help resolve some of these issues had to do with training to make people more sensitive, better, more effectively communicative, on a lot of like anti-bias training as well. And those were our main discussions, very summarized.
Sorry, I think our coordination issues. Thank you. I know we're running short. So if we group 2, do we have a group 2 or no? No. So Justine.
Yeah, so a lot of the topics that folks have already brought up came up in our group. We also talked about how to make participants feel comfortable in a digital setting, which I think is particularly relevant, in COVID times as folks try to think about ways to collect data from afar, and whether doing interviews online or virtually via Zoom is possible, but then how do you kind of build rapport when you're not actually face to face with someone? And we had some suggestions like doing multiple interviews of the same person. And Rebecca Wolfe was in my group, and she also suggested that you also need to make sure that they feel secure in being able to talk to you about whatever topic it is, beyond just, yes, this is awkward to talk through the computer, but beyond that, also they need to feel comfortable and secure that they can divulge information to you in this manner. We also talked about protecting enumerators and those who collect the data for us. And one of the suggestions that we came up with is to have a minimum standard of research that we have to everyone has to agree to, and it's just something that's like a baseline that we can build on, but we don't even have that across various disciplines. And more training on the ethics of implementation and the ethics of interventions, if that's the method that you're using, and how should these reviews be taken on, who should be doing them, and how should people think beyond the IRB about ethics, were other things that came up in our discussion.
Thanks so much. I think one of the things that struck me about what a few different people said is, to do this kind of work ethically, it takes a lot of work. There's really intensive pilot testing, building local partnerships, there's using mixed methods approaches, and fieldwork already takes a lot of time, and to do fieldwork right takes probably double the amount of time. And so, of course, if you're particularly an early career researcher, it's something to think about. I think that we shouldn't compromise on this. Like personally, just as a normative stance from me alone, I think we absolutely shouldn't compromise on this. But it is a question I think we all need to ask ourselves when we sign up to do a project like this. We have to think through, can I actually do all the things I need to do at this point in my career or my life to make this ethical? And if the answer is no, can I bring other people onto the team with me who can help me do this? Or maybe I need to park this idea for another year or two until I can do this. But I think there are a lot of pressures, obviously, if we're in academia, that we need to think about, and we need to be honest with ourselves about whether we can do things ethically. I think also just along those lines, as Biz is saying, bringing others in, you know, if Rebecca, Wolfe, and I are going to go ask people about violence and trauma in Northeastern Nigeria, and someone else is going to come in a few weeks later or a year later and ask the same thing, how do we like bridge these networks and collaborate so that we're not asking people the same types of questions more than once? How do we combine our efforts more? Because maybe it's not distressing in the moment, but it's probably good that we don't ask people the same questions about their trauma over and over again. So just a couple of final thoughts for me. Rebecca, do you have any final thoughts?
You know, I guess one thing is, you know, this is really about trauma and not specifically about conflict, but I think we have to realize that even if our research isn't specifically on trauma in these environments, many of our research participants have been traumatized. And so I think, how can we be sensitive to that? And more so, how can we be sensitive to our enumerators if their local enumerators have also been traumatized in these environments? And again, one thing, you know, in our group we did talk about more is that it could be harder for the enumerators to hear multiple stories in a very short period of time than it might be for our research participants. And so what are the resources we need to provide for them? And think about, again, there is a positionality often between us and our enumerators, and how do we try to adjust for that? I think that's it. I guess Beatrice, yes.
Yes, thank you so much for everyone for your active participation. I think this worked. It was a tryout, so it worked. And thanks the panelists for your thoughts and for guiding us through thinking about these topics. For those of you who'd like to keep chatting with each other about these and related, I think Justin is going to make a breakout room for everyone to kind of end up in. And I just want to also thank all the organizers, Justin, Biz, and Cecilia. This is great. I feel like a lot of the points raised have to do with building community, not replicating each other's works and building on each other. So it feels like literally what this conference is trying to accomplish. So thank you guys so much for organizing this. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of the conference.